Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to DHTV. We're going to talk about education funding, E-rate, and Emergency Connectivity Fund, also known as ECF. I want to thank you guys for being here, and I also want to throw a big thank you to Brian Stevens, the Director of Client Solutions from Funds for Learning. So with the E-rate season upon us and the second ECF window closing just last month, we thought it was a really good time to bring on Brian to share answers to all of the frequently asked questions that his help desk is receiving every day. We do want to keep this informal, and we want to take your questions throughout the session. So if you could just use that Q&A section, the window on your pane. So Brian, why don't we get started with ECF? Why don't you start out with an overview and maybe some questions that your team is getting on a daily basis?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Rhonda, and thanks for having us. We're glad to spend some time with you chatting about sort of the hot topics as it pertains to the Emergency Connectivity Fund and the federal E-rate program. Starting with ECF, if you're not familiar with the program, the Emergency Connectivity Fund is a $7.1 billion fund that was created as a part of the American Rescue Plan Act. Stimulus funding, basically. The program is designed to provide funding for the purchase of internet access and connected devices. That's the term that the program uses, laptops and tablet computers for K-12 schools and public library systems. The idea was that due to the pandemic, many schools had to close, send students home. Many libraries had to figure out how to deliver services and materials, outside the library's walls. And so the Emergency Connectivity Fund was created to provide funding to purchase internet access and devices for remote learning, basically. And so schools and libraries across the country are able to submit funding applications, and the program will then support the purchase of those products and services.
That's pretty cool. I want to just jump in for a second. One of the coolest things I think about the ECF is that it follows like E-rate. It's for public schools and public libraries. I think that's important to make sure that our resellers are aware that any of the public libraries, they can also use these services. And correct me if I'm wrong. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's exactly right.
The big difference between E-rate, which we'll get to in a second, but E-rate versus ECF is that E-rate is for on-campus connectivity, right? And ECF actually expanded that off-campus for the first time?
That's exactly it. And so this is kind of, with the ECF program, this was sort of the first time, if you think about a K-12 student, for example, the E-rate program made sure that student had access to broadband internet connectivity while that student is at school. And then the ECF program made it possible for that student to have access when he leaves school, wherever he happens to go once school is out. And even in some cases on a school bus in between, if that was a link in the chain there. And so it's a really exciting opportunity because it really allows schools to, ensure that their student body are connected essentially 24/7 for the provision of remote learning resources.
That's pretty cool. All right, so what are the top questions you're getting around ECF?
Yeah, so, there's a few. Kind of the first thing that everybody's been kind of curious about is just how much money was requested. So I mentioned that there was $7.1 billion available in the fund. And they've run 2 application windows. They call them windows. Basically, it's an open period of time where the administrators accept applications for funding. So between the 2 windows, the total requested amount right now is about $6.3 billion. So of the 7.1, about 6.3 was requested on funding applications. And we've done some pretty detailed analysis of the applications that were submitted. We have sort of an internal adjustment that we like to make here based on the applications, what we've seen in terms of just what we think is likely to actually be funded. And we've projected that to be about 5.89 billion. And that's just due to a few applications we saw in the system that we feel like are probably mistakes. Sometimes schools accidentally put an extra zero on an application or something like that. In addition to that, there are some funding caps on the price of devices in the program. Some schools went ahead and requested the full cost of their devices, $900 per device. The program's only going to pay $400 per device, and so once those adjustments are made, we expect that $6.3 billion to kind of go down a little bit to a level that's supported by the rules. So that's in terms of the funding that's available. In terms of what was actually requested, it's kind of interesting. We predict about 9.4 million laptops. That would be laptop computers in the traditional sense. Chromebooks as well would be factored into that figure. 1.67 million tablet computers were requested. And it was very common, talking to a lot of the schools that were out there, especially, that they would, a lot of them did sort of a mixture of those types of devices. So lower grades would typically have tablet computers, I think maybe just, easier to use by the younger ones. And then they would start with, Chromebooks or laptops in the upper grades. So in addition to that, there were about 1.6 million hotspots, Wi-Fi hotspots funded. And that would be the devices as well as the service. So a large number of school districts across the country, and also libraries. Rhonda mentioned the libraries. We talked to a lot of library systems that either beefed up an existing hotspot loaning program or started one. Kickstarted having one of those programs as a result of this program, which was really exciting to see. So lots and lots of things that were requested on applications, and it's a tremendous opportunity.
So Brian, a couple questions about all of those numbers, because I'm a numbers person. So if the 5.9 is likely to be funded, what happens? What's the difference? What happens to that delta?
Well, that's a really good question. So the FCC does have the authority to open a third window. So that is a thing that can happen. We suspect that that's probably what they will do. And the way that the program is structured is, if they were to open a third application window, and let's say that they got $2 billion or $3 billion worth of funding requests, there's actually a prioritization mechanism that they have in place that would essentially deplete the rest of the money. And then, everybody below a certain threshold would not be funded just because there wouldn't be enough money available. When they open that, and I see a question in the Q&A here that I think is good. If they were to open a third application window, there's a couple of different things they could do. They could open it for future purchases, so potentially things that schools and libraries would be purchasing, say, July 1st of 22, in a year on from there. They could also potentially open what they would call a retroactive window. It would go all the way back to March 1st of 2020. And schools and libraries that had already purchased laptops, tablets, anything that's eligible could apply to be reimbursed for those costs that they already incurred back from the start of the pandemic. Now, we talked to lots and lots and lots of applicants who said, we're really excited about this program, except that we already purchased all of our stuff. So these initial first two windows, they said July 1st of this year through June 30th of next year was the time frame that they would fund purchases made within that time frame. A lot of applicants told us, well, we've already purchased our things. When we sent everybody home for the pandemic, we bought all these laptops. And so we suspect that if there were a retroactive window, the rest of that money would get snapped up very quickly.
Yeah, I would expect that as well. There is another question in the Q&A, which I think is a great one. So remember, our audience is resellers. So how can a reseller actually help their schools take advantage of this program?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, the application windows are closed. So Rhonda mentioned that the application window, the second one, closed last month. So at least in terms of where we're at right now, there's not an opportunity to go back and file. Well, technically, a school could go in and file an application now. they would need a waiver of the application deadline in order for that application to be considered. And the FCC may grant some of those waivers for late applications, just depending on the circumstances. But, moving forward, I think, number one, there very well could be a third window. So that might be an opportunity to go and request some additional funding. The other thing to consider is that now that they have run this Emergency Connectivity Fund program, I think a lot of folks have been looking at it as sort of a test run, if you want to think of it that way, for a potential long-term funding source or an ongoing funding source to provide funding for these types of expenditures. This is the first time this has ever been done on a large scale like this, and I think that schools and libraries really showed up for it. They said, "Hey, we're willing to file these applications and follow these rules in order to get the funding for these devices." And so, I think the next logical question is, because the ECF was a temporary program, it was given a single allocation of $7.1 billion. And once it's gone, at least right now. I say, well, what happens next? Eventually those devices that we purchased are going to get old. They're going to need to be replaced. Where's the money going to come to do that? Certainly you can't ask us to arm our students with all the devices that they need and then just, have us not be able to do that 2 or 3 years down the line. And so, I think staying tuned to, the legislation, the talk about, where this is potentially going. There's lots of talks about infrastructure funding and all those sorts of things. We very well could see a new program, could be an extension of the E-rate program. There's a lot of things being discussed that would then provide these opportunities on an ongoing basis.
That was a really good point. That was one of the questions we get from resellers all the time. Well, so what about refresh, right? A lot of the schools are worried about spending this money because they knew they couldn't refresh it. So what happens long term? So thank you for addressing that. That was perfect timing. Okay, so what other questions is your team really fielding around ECF?
Sure. Yeah. So for those of us that are, that have customers that have filed these applications, I think that's one of the very first things that we get questions right out of the box is, okay, my customer filed an application. When is it going to be approved? They're ready to move forward. And the answer is they are approving applications now. So the way that it works is they issue funding decisions in batches, for lack of a better term. The official term they use is obligation files, which just sounds so like obligation files. It's very like you expect the government to say something like that, right? They're batches or groups, and they've been sort of sporadic. In the E-rate program, they do the same thing, but they're on a pretty regular schedule. They do them on Fridays. In ECF, it's kind of been just whenever one shows up, one shows up. But they've already worked through about $2 billion worth of those applications, which is fantastic. They're moving very, very quickly, considering that, these filing windows have only been closed for, the first one for a couple of months. So monitoring that is really useful. The customer should receive an email notification once their application has been approved. And depending on how you as a vendor are registered with the program, you may also receive a notification that the application's approved. But in any event, it's not bad practice just to log in, keep tabs on the activity of the applications and that sort of thing. And again, we'll see these batches. There'll be additional batches of funding decisions released until they work through all the applications that are in the queue.
Okay, and were the batches that they're doing, is it in order of receipt?
No, not really.
It's just random.
Yeah, I mean, they don't publish any details about their queue or how they're selecting applications. All of the applications go under a review process. So it's very common a school submits an application and then a month or so down the line, they get questions from the program administrator. A lot of times they ask for a copy of a quote or an invoice or something just to verify that the amount requested is correct. Those types of things. They can ask additional questions about compliance issues as well. And so that's always a bit of an unknown, how long it takes the school to respond and if there's follow-up and that sort of thing. So, maybe there's a general kind of first in, first out, but I don't think that's done in any official capacity.
Okay, so what we can tell our resellers is that currently about $2 billion of the 7.1 of ECF has been released to the schools, has been approved and released. So to the reseller partners, your schools will start, you'll start seeing those orders come in and confirm, right? That's okay. Just to setting their expectations. Good stuff.
Yeah. You know, it very well could be that you may see some orders even if those applications are not funded. So one of the requirements is that the purchases be made between July 1st of this year and June 30th of 2022. And so, and some schools and libraries were in positions where they said, we have to purchase these devices regardless of whether this money is approved or not. You know, they said, this is a purchase we're going to make no matter what. We'll fund it using some other source if the ECF doesn't come through. And so we have seen a lot of schools that have already started making purchases or placed orders, even though they're still waiting on a decision that's allowable for them to do that.
So, Brian, there's a great question in the chat that I've heard from a couple different partners now. We know that the schools have to be authorized to participate in the ECF program, just like they do for E-rate, right? So all of the schools and libraries that were qualified for E-rate are also qualified for ECF. But how does that relate to a reseller? So does a reseller have to be qualified in any way to provide a quote, or can any reseller quote product for use in these funds?
Yeah, it's open to anyone. So I would say the only limitation, if there is one, would just be legal issues, right? State and local law, whether or not a school or a library is allowed to purchase from that vendor. But beyond that, there are no restrictions or requirements. And in fact, on the funding applications that schools and libraries submitted, they could just list a vendor by name. They didn't even have to actually supply an identification number or a tax ID or any sort of identifying information other than the name of the service provider and some contact information for that service provider. Service provider in this program is the term we use for resellers.
Gotcha. So another question that comes up a couple times, one around inventory, right? So we're having some supply chain challenges. So one, what if the product isn't available by that deadline of June 30th? But also another question that piggybacks on that is, what if the school decides to change suppliers because of inventory, right? How does that get handled with ECF?
That's a great question. And actually I have a very similar one that was in my FAQs here. So yeah, right now, in terms of the regulations, what they say is that the equipment that is being purchased with this money has got to be on school property in their hands, for lack of a better term, by June 30th of 2022. The rules themselves right now do not allow for extensions of that deadline. Now, that being said, the FCC is aware that this is an issue. So certainly, you know, they know about the supply chain issues, the concerns. The FCC could issue basically a blanket waiver of their own deadline. They do that in the context of the E-rate program for various reasons. So, you know, we haven't heard any rumors or any possibility of that happening, but it is something that's technically possible. So it's a big concern, and I'm getting that feedback from a lot of resellers. I'm getting it from a lot of schools and libraries who are hearing it from their resellers saying, hey, we really just can't give you any sort of hard estimate on when some of these things are going to be available. There are a couple of things that they can consider. One is when they submit the funding application, they're providing essentially a bill of materials, right? So they're actually specifying a make, a model, a quantity, a unit price, et cetera, on that funding application. The rules do allow them to make changes to that once the application is approved. So they may have submitted for model ABC 123, and we know that there's just not going to be any more of those available, but we might be able to get an ABC 456, right? And so the school could submit paperwork to update the make and model of the item that they're purchasing to something that potentially might be available on time. And we're seeing a lot of that happening for that very reason.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and it's a relatively painless process as well. It's a bit of additional paperwork they have to file. I mean, it's all online, but there's a form they fill out. But it does give them that flexibility. Now, the only downside to that is, if they specify that they were purchasing Chromebooks at $279 each, and they're going to buy a new model that's $319, the program's not going to increase the funding to cover the difference, unfortunately. So they're kind of stuck with the amount that they originally were committed. But at least it gives them that flexibility. They can actually change resellers as well. So I mentioned that they, on the application, they specify whom they're purchasing their devices from. They can submit additional paperwork to change that reseller as well. So I'm not seeing as many of those changes that are being made, but it is something that is possible for them to do. In the same way they can change the products, they can change the reseller, and in some cases they may need to do both, depending on what they're doing.
Right, availability.
Yeah, exactly. That's
the world
exactly
we live in.
Yeah,
for sure. So, I'm sorry. These questions, guys, these are great questions. Keep them coming. So definitely keep them coming.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, like I mentioned, we know that the FCC is aware of the supply chain concerns, and we have a lot of experience working with program administration on the E-rate side of things. ECF is new, but it's still administered by the FCC and USAC, and so and a lot of the rules are very similar. So. Like I mentioned, it's really not uncommon for the FCC to come in and say, hey, we know this happened. We're willing to extend deadlines, those sorts of things. That said, here we are in early November. That would be uncharacteristically early for them to make that decision. So unfortunately, I think if we do see a blanket extension, we may not know for a while whether or not we're going to get that.
Right. I gotcha. That's fair. Okay. So do we have other questions around ECF that you're getting on a regular basis, or do we want to move on to E-rate? So I do want to make sure we talk about both.
Yeah. No, I think that's really kind of some of the top ones that we're receiving right now. It was a tremendous opportunity for everyone. Certainly the schools and libraries that are able to arm their students and patrons with this technology, but for the resellers that are out there, provided that you can get your hands on the devices to sell, it was a large number of devices funded.
Okay, that's fantastic. All right, let's move on to E-rate. So if you don't mind, give us a quick overview of what the E-rate program is, maybe how it differs from ECF if we need to, but then let's kick off with whatever your top E-rate question that you get every day.
Yeah, absolutely. So the E-rate program is a little bit different in that it's been around for a long time. The first funding year in E-rate was 1998, and it's gone every year since then. And I mentioned at the beginning that the E-rate program differs in that it pays for on-campus services. So internet access, wide area network connectivity, and network infrastructure components, things like switches, routers, wireless access points and controllers, cabling, all the kind of building blocks of a local area network. All of those things are eligible for E-rate funding, provided that they're on school property. And they're very strict about the fact that it has to be limited to, supporting school and library owned locations, basically. E-rate's a little different in that it's a discount program. So instead of paying the full cost, ECF, there was a $400 per laptop funding cap. But if they bought devices that cost $379, this program would pay the entire cost of that device. In the E-rate program, it's a discount. So the school is always going to be responsible for paying some portion of the cost, and their matching portion depends on kind of the relative level of poverty in their community. So the more students they have in the district that qualify for free lunches under the National School Lunch Program, the higher the E-rate discounts go, and they range anywhere from 20 to 90%, just depending on where the schools fall on that scale. The other kind of notable thing about E-rate is there are a considerably higher number of regulations associated with it. So, as an ongoing sort of permanent funding source, It just, especially as it's sort of evolved over the years, and they've improved the regulations, honed them, clarified them. It's a little bit more complicated of a process than the ECF was. And one example of that is that schools that want to receive E-rate discounts have to conduct a competitive bid. So in ECF, the FCC said, hey, whatever state and local purchasing rules a school or a library is subject to, we're good with that. So as long as they followed their own purchasing rules, we're not going to impose any additional requirements on procurement for ECF. E-rate is very, very different than that, and they say that every single purchase must be competitively bid for E-rate in order to qualify for E-rate discounts. And so what that does is it sets up an opportunity for the resellers that are out there, because this program requires schools to go out to bid in order to receive the funds. It allows you to, locate and respond to potential opportunities as these bids open and are being filed and that sort of thing. So that's kind of a broad overview of E-rate, but really, you can think about in terms of eligibility, internet access services, so the internet bandwidth that's consumed by a school or library, as well as their wide area networks, so the networks that are connecting all the various buildings in a school system or library system in a network. Those are what we call Category 1 services. And then local area network infrastructures is the term there is Category 2 services, and both are eligible for a discount.
Okay. So I have let's back up to ECF real quick. One more question. Is there available for resellers to access a list of the schools that received funding through ECF? I know that that kind of thing is available through E-rate. Is that for ECF as well?
Yeah, the E-rate program administrator, the ECF program administrator is making some data available. So they have a portal that's called Open Data. And it's a website that you can go to, and you can actually download, export, kind of to a certain extent filter the applications that are out there. I will say that it's a bit of an unwieldy data set. It's there's a lot of columns and a lot of rows, and there's some repeated fields, and it takes a little bit of knowledge to dig through it, but the data is generally out there. Now, if you're a reseller who's participating, especially if you've registered with the program and have a service provider identification number, it's also called a Form 498 ID, you can log into the administrator's portal and see your own funding applications that are in there. So anytime a school listed you as a service provider, you can go in and see those applications in the portal system. If beyond that, you've got to go out and sort of weed through the mass of all of the applications that were submitted to find that information.
Okay, that's good to know. Sounds like a lot of work, but it's good to know.
Yeah, and I suspect that there will be a fair amount of analysis done on that data. Like I said, we've already done quite a bit of that. I think that as one of the best things that's going to come out of this, we mentioned the possibility of a permanent funding source for these types of things. I think they were really trying to gauge what's the true cost. If we were going to satisfy this need on an ongoing basis, how much money is really going to be required to do that? And so I think they're going to be using this application data to kind of, size up and try to figure out, okay, we can estimate about this much is needed, then how do we come up with that money?
Okay. All right. So more top questions around E-rate. What you got?
Yeah. So, give this one all the time. We're excited. When is the application window for E-rate going to open? And I don't even know why I chose this as a frequently asked question, because I don't know the answer to that. They haven't announced it yet. So it will probably open in January, and it will probably close in March. That's generally when they open and close them. But the dates are a tiny bit different every single year. And so we just have to wait until they make an announcement. But, they've been fairly consistent over the past few years, COVID extensions notwithstanding, that saying, hey, we're going to open in January and close in March. Usually a week or two into January, and then sometime in mid-March is typically when they close it. So What that means for the resellers that are out there, especially, is the procurement process for E-rate, when schools are going out to bid, has to happen before they submit these applications in this filing window. So you're going to see the peak of the procurement activity for E-rate starting now, frankly, and just continuing to increase steadily through the rest of this month, December, January, and the first part of February. So I'd say late December, all through January, and the first couple weeks of February is when you're going to see large numbers of these procurements that go out. There's around 25,000 of them per year that get filed by the time it's all said and done. And the biggest majority of those happen within the space of a couple months.
How many thousand?
About 25,000 individual procurements are started each year. And so it's a lot. And it comes at you a bit like a fire hose, frankly, just because human nature being what it is, right? Everybody waits until the last minute. So the schools are required to keep their bids open for 28 days. And so because of that requirement, they figure out what the deadline for the application is. They count back 28 days, and they know that's kind of the drop dead date to file their procurement and get started on that process. So best practices there, really, if you're a reseller, if it's been networking equipment, those types of services, maintenance, professional services, that sort of thing. Making sure that you've got a reliable source to get those opportunities as they're being filed is really useful because they're required to be open for 28 days. If you can find that opportunity on day one, it gives you the most possible time. Pull together a proposal, talk to the schools about what they need, that sort of thing.
Okay, that's good. Very good information. All right, keep those questions coming, guys. You're doing great. Some of the questions are exactly what you have, your frequently asked questions that you prepared. So that's kind of perfect.
Yeah.
Clearly, they are, in fact, the frequently asked questions, right?
In fact, yeah, that's good. I'm glad I'm not off here. So, no, absolutely. Yeah. So, this is one that we get every year. What do you think the demand is going to do? That's always, where's it going to go? Is it going to be more or less? So that's really hard to predict. And as many experts as there are in E-rate is about how many answers you're going to get. Funds for Learning, we did a survey. So every year we survey the E-rate community, specifically the schools and libraries that are participating in the program. This year we received a response from roughly 10% of the overall applicant population, which is really great for there's a really great percentage for a survey like this. Interestingly, almost 3/4 of the respondents to our survey indicated that they intend to make some network infrastructure purchases in this next funding window. So this funding year 22, the applications that are going to open up in January. That's a pretty high number. Now, I suspect that the ECF program may be driving some of that. So a school has got ECF funding on the way. They're going to purchase 10,000 new devices. And I'm hoping that the way they answered our survey is them thinking forward and thinking, oh, that's going to put a lot of additional demand on my Wi-Fi network. I better make sure that it's up to par before all those devices start streaming into school. And so I suspect that we'll see, a fair number of infrastructure upgrades made just as a result of the increase of devices that are going to be joining school and library networks.
Right.
So that's a good sign, I think. The E-rate program itself, it has an annual allocation of about $4 billion per year. And over the past few years, not quite that much per year has been requested. So schools actually have not requested that full $4 billion. It's been roughly $3 billion per year is about what's been requested. So there's plenty of money. The good news about that is that pretty much everybody who applies and follows the rules gets gets the money. So there's not really a concern right now that they're going to run out of money in the E-rate program. There's actually plenty there. But you know, and like I say, if our survey is any indicator, we may see, you know, an uptick in demand overall. If you look at the demand for Category 1 services like internet access and those sorts of things, we're seeing a really obvious trend that the amount requested each year is actually going down a bit each year. And at the same time, the speed, the bandwidth of the connections that are being requested is going up. So capacities are increasing and prices are decreasing is what the data is telling us, which is to be expected when you require a competitive bid and all. That's just sort of what the program is designed to do. But just in terms of overall, I think, you know, I definitely don't see any indicators that we're going to see a really low year. If anything, I would say it's going to be on par with the past few years, if not more, for the upcoming year.
That's excellent. There's a question that has been raised for the second time in the chat, and I want to make sure I address it. Yes, this is being recorded, and it will be available online at dnh.com/DHTV by early next week. Maybe as soon as tomorrow, but I'm not going to promise that. So by early next week, we do expect to have that posted. So www.dnh.com/DHTV. So just wanted to make sure that we address that because I've been getting a couple of questions about it. Sorry. All right, what other questions do we have around E-rate? It's a big topic, and it's a big deal. And I'm really glad you addressed the timeline, right? Like, now is the time that our resellers need to be focused on working with their schools and saying, okay, what are we going to have? And make sure that they're putting the bids out and making sure they know about the bids as early as possible. The 28 days, that's really good information to have. So that's what the resellers can do today. And then when the application period opens up, you know, again, and the more that our resellers can provide to the schools, the better the likelihood that they're building that relationship, that they can be included, right? That makes the most sense. What else are you guys hearing questions about?
Yeah, you know, along that line, it's actually a good point. You know, if you are new to E-rate, you're interested in this, you know, you are, you know, talking to some schools and libraries that may want to purchase products and services from you and apply for these discounts. Unlike the ECF program that we talked about earlier, in the E-rate program, you do have to register. So in order for a school to request discounts on purchases from you, they have to identify you using a specific identifier that's assigned to you by the E-rate program administrator. It's called a SPIN, or a service provider identification number. They're not difficult to get, but there are a few steps that you have to do. So I would say, you know, step one is to go ahead and get registered. There's no cost, and it's not a vetting process. So they're not evaluating you for suitability or whether your products and services are eligible for this funding. They're just assigning you an identification number so that a school can list you on an application. So I'd say if you don't have a SPIN, it's worth going ahead and registering for one so that you'll be ready whenever the school gets ready to file a funding application. And then from that point, it's watching for those bids as they hit the street, getting in touch with those potential customers and providing them proposals and moving on from there.
Do you need to register for a SPIN number every year, or is once you're in, you're in?
No, it's kind of a one and done. Once you get your SPIN, it's yours to keep forever. It is tied to some additional numbers like your Dun & Bradstreet number, your federal tax ID, those sorts of things. So they associate those numbers together. There is an annual certification that's required in order for funds to flow. And so what that is essentially you as a service provider in this E-rate program have to file a form each year that says, I agree to abide by this program's rules and regulations. And so that's an annual certification that's filed. But the SPIN doesn't change from year to year. It always stays current. On occasion, you may need to update contact information or something like that, but they live on forever.
Okay. And again, we said it earlier, I just want to say it again. If you are registered and if the school can purchase on E-rate, they can also purchase through ECF.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Same thing with the resellers, right? If they can buy from you on E-rate, they can buy from you on ECF.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay,
absolutely.
excellent. All right, any additional questions? You guys keep putting them in the chat. Any other points from you that you're hearing, Brian?
Yeah, we do get this question a lot from folks that are maybe E-rate veterans or have already been participating in the program for a while. They say, hey, is there anything I need to be aware of? What are the big changes for this year? So you can usually tell the folks that have been doing E-rate for a while because they ask this question and because they know that the rules and processes have a tendency to change year over year. Now, for this upcoming year, the answer here really is not much. By and large, the regulations, the eligibility requirements, and the processes are going to be very, very similar to what they were in funding year 2021. Now, you can look at that a couple of different ways. One way is as sort of a negative because there's always a hope that they may add additional types of products and services as eligible for this funding. Cybersecurity being the number one example of that. The FCC is being inundated with requests to add additional network security components to the scope of eligible services in the E-rate program. Makes perfect sense. Schools are under cyber attacks all day long. It does not take long to find a report of one, read the paper. It's clearly a big need. It's also a very large expense. And so, the schools are kind of clamoring for some help in dealing with that. Right now, the level of security products that the E-rate program funds is very, very minimal, just a basic kind of old school firewall and nothing beyond that. So, when we say there's not really that many changes coming, might be kind of disappointing from that perspective. The flip side of that is that consistency does this program well. So I've been doing this a long time, and the stretches that we have where the rules kind of stay relatively static are kind of nice because it gives schools a little bit more confidence that they're doing it well, that they're not scared away by a bunch of new things that they're going to have to learn or do, that sort of thing. It tends to sort of encourage participation a little bit whenever the rules don't get changed around year after year after year. So from that perspective, I think it's a positive thing that we're not dealing with a bunch of uncertainty and all that sort of thing, especially given that ECF was brand new, never been done before. All the questions on Earth were being asked about ECF, and nobody had the answers, right? E-rate established, we know what's going on, we can answer those questions, so that consistency is nice in that context.
So that leads me to a question from Tim. He asks, how do you access the database of schools and libraries that are participating in E-rate and ECF? Yeah,
that's a great question. That information is available publicly via the program administrator's website. So that's usac.org. And you can find that information there. Now, I will tell you that it is scattered out across various tools and search options and databases and CSV downloads, and it's not the most user-friendly process to get your hands on that information, but it is available out there. There are third-party services. My company offers one that do all that collection for you, aggregation, makes it easy to find the information. But it is public data that's out there that you can find.
It's very good data. Yes, what you guys compile it saves enormous amounts of work. So yes, props to you guys. Okay, and did you have one more question? Did you have one on your list, Brian?
Oh, I think I pretty much covered.
Oh, did you? Okay, good.
Yeah. At least in terms of the slides and the FAQs that I had prepared ahead of time.
Okay, great. Oh, okay. So there's a question in the chat about your fees. So, what do you charge for the services? So why don't I can have them reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd be happy to.
Yep. So everybody, I will put this in the chat as well, to reach out to Brian and his team for any additional questions on E-rate or ECF funding, like we've gone over today. You can reach them at help@fundsforlearning.com. It's pretty simple. help@fundsforlearning.com. Pretty good stuff. So some notes I made The bid process, I think that's great. I did not realize the bids were 28 days, so I learned something new today. I think everybody learned something new today. This was a lot of information. And based on our conversation, there's one more question. Oh, sorry. The question is, again, yes, this is being recorded, and yes, it will be made available at www.dnh.com, sorry, dnh.com/DHTV. It'll be up probably early next week, maybe sooner, unless we get attacked by cats. So that's the plan. You just never know. But the plan is early next week, no later. But I'm not seeing any more questions, so I do want to close up. Unless you have anything else, Brian, I'll do a quick close up. You good?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today, and I encourage, to the extent that if there's resellers out there that maybe you're just kind of dipping a toe in the water for E-Rate or considering that, it really is a fantastic opportunity. What we see is that this funding source serves as kind of a catalyst in a lot of cases to build relationships, new relationships with new customers that then can blossom into long-term relationships that lead to sales that even are, things that fall outside the E-Rate program. So schools are always going to have technology needs that are not funded by these programs. It just really gives you an opportunity to establish those relationships and then, become a trusted partner for a wide variety of technology needs for these schools and libraries that are out there. And so we see a lot of resellers and companies leverage that successfully. And beyond that, it's good for everyone. So this program is making sure that our students, our K-12 students and our public library patrons are connected to the internet, have access to online learning resources. And so when it works well for everyone. It's a great opportunity.
It is. It's a great program. And you and your whole team at Funds for Learning is super helpful, super knowledgeable on everything E-Rate, everything ECF. You guys are good at answering my questions on an almost daily basis. So I thank you personally, but also on behalf of D&H for being here today. I also want to point out, so while we did focus on E-Rate and ECF funding today, there is a lot of additional funding available from the federal level into education through all the stimulus packages, right? The CARES Act, and the American Rescue Plan, everything. So we have a couple resources on our website for our partners that help explain all of those federal programs as well. So you can feel free to download those at dnh.com/education. We have currently, there's a spreadsheet that kind of analyzes what programs are out there and what types of products qualify for each. Within the next week or two, we'll be uploading a white paper that will give you resources on how each state is dispensing all of those funds and so you can find out what schools have been funded. That's in addition to what we talked about today with E-Rate and ECF. So again, there's a lot of funding out there for education. If you have any additional questions around ECF or E-Rate, again, help@fundsforlearning.com. Brian and his team will be happy to help you. But in closing, I want to make sure that you guys are aware that if we have any further questions about D&H and our education program, you can reach out to us at education@dnh.com. Also, the next D&H TV webcast is scheduled for next November 11th. That is next week. The content is going to be around the hybrid workspace. It's called Building Solutions for Hybrid Workspace. So November 11th, 2 p.m. Eastern, you can catch us right here. Any questions? Oh, and if you want to register for that event, I'm so sorry. If you want to register for that event, it's www.dandh.com/solutionslab. Go there and you can register for our next D&H TV session called Building Solutions for a Hybrid Workspace. And with that, Brian, I want to thank you and thank all of you for attending. You've been a great audience, lots of great questions, lots of good information. Thank you so much.
Thank you.